Welcome to Windy Night Stories. The night is coming on. The wind is rising. The moon is full. It's time for a story. Tonight's story is by Birch and Sidney Phelps. Geordie Blairs' Luck. Nothing very sensational happened in our little local circle before the poker craze got among us. Prior to that, we were content to play euchre, whist, nap, and such like steady-going games, in which a man knew where he was for 10 minutes together, and could smoke and moisten meanwhile. But when the poker mania got a start, it spread like an epidemic. Before long, a poker club was originated, and, of course, everyone joined, whether they meant to play or not, but there weren't many sleeping partners. We all went for it, and George Blair, Geordie as we called him, among the number. Now, poker's a serious game, a business, I might say. It isn't the sort of thing, especially when they're just bitten with it, that men play for love. 2 a.m. would have been seen the end of most card parties in our district up to the time I was writing of, but with the new game, 10 in the next morning would still find them hard at it as often as not, and when fellows go to such lengths and indulgent, they don't play for wax vestas. As a consequence, no one was exactly pleased when Geordie joined as an original member and started into play, for he had an accumulation of debts as the result of various other games, and there was no such radical change in his circumstances apparent as to suggest the probability of settlement. However, he was such a favorite that no one proved ill-natured enough to say anything about the matter, and we all hoped his luck would change. No one reproached Geordie with a stringency of principle in a general way, but he's a perfect Bayard on impulse, and just about the beginning of the poker club, he was seized with one of his capricious moods in regard to his obligations, not, however, to the intense regret of his creditors, in a financial direction. It was quite in another way, and one in which he didn't secure much approbation. Geordie had developed a passion for a very pretty Burmese girl, whom he discovered in his vicinity, an occurrence new neither to Geordie nor his neighbors, but here he became unconventional, for he was at no pains to conceal the fact that he intended to marry the girl. Public sentiment, conservative to a degree, condemned him, so far as anyone was adversely criticized in such matters, and laughed at him. But Geordie was not deterred. Either his latent scruples were stirred, or, what was more widely believed, the girl shaped him to her purpose, but anyhow, marry her he said he would, and marry her he did. I was the only witness and went over to breakfast with him in order to be so, and a funny meal it was. Considering the number present, there couldn't have been more variety. There was the padre, who Geordie had asked to do up the business, and who was only too anxious to take a hand. There was Geordie, myself, and the lady, who knew as much about European table customs as Geordie did of what was going to happen to him. However, talk about tact, she was full of it, and all she did wrong was as pretty to watch as if she'd done it right. When we'd finished, the padre lost no time in advancing matters, doing the girl's part for her when she forgot her business, and keeping Geordie, who was not much better than she was, up to his. I never saw a man so pleased with his handiwork in my life. He wanted to baptize Dasi, as she was called, after she was married, but she'd have none of it, at which he was disappointed a good bit. But we all sat down afterwards to a game of euchre, in connection with which 2 things much surprised me. One was that Dasi played a wonderfully good game, and the other was that something happened to Geordie's luck, for he never lost from the moment we began. It got monotonous. He didn't care to dissolve the partnership he'd just gone into, so he and Dasi played together, and, as far as I can remember, went lone hands alternately. I and the padre were out of it, and after losing all his wedding fees the latter got up, went out on the veranda and swore. I know he did, because I followed to see what he was up to, and heard him. As for Dasi, she sat like a little heathen divinity where she was, and counted the plunder, while Geordie laughed at her and us. That began it. Geordie was very seldom away from the poker club after the opening night, and he played the game on the same lines as he played euchre on his wedding day. The luck would just flutter round the table and then roost on Geordie's shoulder for the rest of the night, if it lasted till the next. Dasi always came with him, which seemed strange just at first, but the club had no precedents to run on, the members didn't care, and as it was my bungalow they met to play at, there was no one to take exception. Besides, Everyone liked her when she came dressed in her peculiar way, with the last jewelry Geordie had given her on, making herself prettily agreeable before cards began, and chaffing those she liked in a quiet, shy way with a laugh like the tinkle of her bangles. Whenever Geordie commenced to play, however, she would sit watching him without a word and hardly a movement, sometimes sitting on the arm of his chair, or at the back away from him, but always still and silent. At such times no one could get a word out of her until the game stopped, and then sometimes she would mix a cocktail for those who had been playing and hand it round with a grace and condescension all her own. There's a reaction to every sort of excitement, and presently our fellows cooled off poker, especially when the race meetings and polo drew near. Some had lost more than they cared to, others wanted their ready cash for ponies, and only a few kept at the card table. Geordie was one of these. His luck had never faltered, and he had paid off first his card debts, then his racing ones, and was finally making a hole in his general liabilities, which had seemed so impossible of discharge in the past that he had forgotten some of them. His winning hadn't lost anybody much cash so far, but the boys were getting anxious as to the time when he would turn the corner and draw blood every time. One night most of them were at my place, but the poker was nearly dead, and only 3 were playing up in one corner. The others were arranging matches, talking ponies, or trying to draw Dasi, as she sat on the side of the table in one of her imperturbable moods, treating them like so many graven images. After a bit, one of those at the table got up and concluded he'd had enough for that day, throwing Geordie his IOU as he rose. "There, you greedy devil. That's all you get from me today." "Right you are," replied Geordie. "Don't make a toil of a pleasure. Let's chuck it for a bit." Before he got up, he made a rough reckoning with a burnt match on the paper, and leaned back in his chair. "See here, you chaps," he cried. "I'm only 1,000 rupees to the bad in the world. Another week of my luck would wipe it right off." "Why the deuce don't you fleece somebody else, Geordie?" said one of those standing around. "We shan't half fill the lotteries if you go on as you're going." "Yes, by Jupiter," said another. "Just the very thing, now you speak of it. The men down at Rangapor have just got it badly, and they sent me an invitation for any of our fellows to go down and try their luck with 'em. There you are, Geordie. Trot over, old man, and give 'em a hair of the dog that's been biting us." "Thunder," shouted Geordie, jumping up. "I will, if only for the honor of the district. Lend us some dacks, you chaps, and I'll ride over next week." "You shall have all my stable, begad," said the man he had just been playing with, "if you go at once, and promise not to play with me any more." Everyone laughed at this, and Dasi, who was all smiles again, held up a wine-glass and drank confusion to the Rangapor gamesters. After that night I didn't see anything of Geordie for a bit, but a good many men looked in an evening or so afterwards, and the talk ran on him and his successes. "Ever since he married the girl, he's been scoring," said one. "I thought him an awful fool at the time, but she's been a regular little mascot to him, and no mistake." "Well, I'm free to confess she beats me," said another. "I can't fathom her anyhow. Of course she's pretty as a gem, but she gives me the creeps." "Creeps be hanged," said I. "Dasi always makes me laugh. Pretty little soul." "I mean what I say, though," said the last speaker earnestly. "The other night I was walking across the room, while you chaps were playing, when all of a sudden I felt shaky and queer, as if I was going to get fever, and, don't laugh, begad, there seemed to be a lot of hearts and diamonds and so on dancing before my eyes. I dare say it was liver or something, but when I moved it left me, and I saw I'd been standing in front of Dasi, in between her and Geordie. It may have been fancy, but it seemed to me she looked mad at me being there." "Great Scott!" called out a man from the other side of the room who had hitherto been silent. "Did you notice that too? It happened like that to me, only I had a skinful and was afraid you beggars would chaff me. I thought it was something in John's whiskey here." "If it was, old man, I guess you found it." And a gust of laughter banished the subject, but I thought of it all many a time afterward. When they were all riding away, one of them, a distant neighbor of mine, called back from the road. "By the way," he shouted, "I heard from the barber this morning that Geordie was a bit seedy the other day. Seen him lately?" "No," I yelled as he went out of earshot, "but I'll run over tomorrow to him." And the next evening I paid that strangest of all visits. It was well on towards sundown when I started, but as it was only a mile or so, I determined to walk it in the cool of the evening, and it didn't take me long to reach his bungalow. It stood quite by itself, back from the road, almost hidden by palms and orange trees. No one seemed about as I walked up, and I went straight indoors as I was in the habit of doing. The light was just turning, and I couldn't very well see at first when I got into the sitting room, but when I could, I looked pretty hard at what I saw. The place seemed covered with cards. Cards on the table, cards on the floor, even on the chairs, all carefully set out in some sort of order, and amidst them all sat Dasi, her hands full of them too. When she saw me, she sprang to her feet, wild-eyed and confused. "Good heavens, Dasi," I said. "What on earth are you up to?" But she only stared at me in a troubled sort of way and said nothing. "Where's Geordie?" I asked. "Geordie's asleep," she replied. "Asleep?" I echoed. "Has he been ill?" "Yes, but he's better. He's asleep now. He had fever." "Let me have a look at him," I said, going towards the bedroom. "No," she said, getting in between me and the door. "Don't go in. You'll wake him." "Nonsense. Now I'm here, I'll see him." "It won't do him any good," she said. "He'd better sleep. Don't go in." I got impatient with what I thought her silliness and spoke rather sharply. "Come, Dasi. Don't be a foolish girl. Of course I must see him at once." Then without a word she stood aside to let me pass, and I opened the door and went into the bedroom. The instant I did so, it gave me a turn, for the fetid taint of the air told me there was a dead body in the room. I went nervously across to the bed, and there, with the last gleam of the sunset falling through the window on him, lay poor Geordie Blairs, dead beyond all doubt. I shall never forget him as he laid before me, for, after the first shock of my discovery, I saw that he was dressed in the evening dress of the country, in his white jacket, shirt, and trousers, with a broad blue silk cummerbund that he always wore, but, strangest of all, with a pack of cards in his hand, evidently put there after his death. I turned hurriedly to the girl, who had followed me in, and was huddled up at the foot of the bed, crying passionately. "When did he die, Dasi?" I asked in a low voice. "He isn't dead," she sobbed. "Did you put those clothes on him?" But no answer would she give, continuing to wail and shudder with grief. "He isn't dead," she cried again at last. I was fairly upset, but I went and stood over her and tried to make her understand. "It's no good, Dasi. Poor Geordie's dead. Come, get up. There's a good girl, and help me get things straight." Still she wouldn't move, but stayed just as she was. Then the thought struck me that no time should be lost in getting him to a station for burial. "Look, Dasi," I began again, kneeling beside her where she lay. "I must send the men to carry him into the station tonight. It will be best to move him now." But before I could finish what I was saying, she leapt to her feet, quivering with excitement. "He shan't be moved," she screamed. "He mustn't be touched. He will stop where he is." As a general rule, I'm pretty hard to scare, but she startled me so that I fairly cried out, "For mercy's sake, don't go on like this, Dasi. You know I am only doing it for his sake and yours. You know he must go, Bibi. Don't be unreasonable." She changed at once and came to me, putting her hands on my shoulders. "It is true he must go, but not tonight. He must be untouched tonight." I was anxious enough to humor her, but climate is climate in burying people, and it is always an ugly business in that place. Then she gave me another start by continuing, "No, he will remain as he is. He will not change," just as if she knew what I was thinking of. By that time I was feeling pretty queer, and not disposed to contest points with her. Besides, after all, it was a matter of hours. So I told her it should be as she wished, and went to take another look at the poor fellow. I didn't look for very long, for, whether it was the light or my nerves, I don't know, but he didn't seem quite like a dead man, though the signs of death were already growing on him, and he was ghastly beyond all description, dressed as he was with those cards in his hand. I turned away and asked Dasi if she wanted for anything, promising to send some servants over to her from my bungalow, but she said she didn't want them, and I wasn't sorry when she refused my offer to stay in the place during the night. Indeed, I couldn't have done it, for I had to hurry off to arrange matters as it was. I went back through the dusk, and it was dark before I reached my own place, but after I had eaten something, I started down to the bazaar to get some men together. Then fresh troubles ensued, for when they heard who they were to carry, they all refused, and money wouldn't buy them. I knew many of them had done the same thing not long since, but, as I say, when they knew it meant a visit to Blair Sahib's bungalow, for some reason or another, they chucked their hands right out. I didn't know what on earth to do until it occurred to me to ride down to the police lines and get the superintendent to give me a file of men. When I had done this, and arranged for a relay to go on ahead, halfway to the station, it was nearly 1 a.m. Then I went home and started to make a coffin with the help of my servants, and when it was ready, I dropped off to sleep without knowing it. I woke at daybreak and found the men waiting for me in front of my porch, and I rode over to the scene with them following on foot. When we got there, I told them to wait outside, and went into the same room as the evening before, noticing that it had been cleared up and wore its ordinary appearance. There was no one about, so I called out for Dasi, and as no answer came, I went to the bedroom to look in, and found the door fastened on the inside. I knocked but heard nothing in return, and I was just about to go around to look in the window, when my ears caught a strange sound, and a sickly sort of feeling seized me. It sounded as if all the air was being driven out of the room. I could not enter, and I felt a cold, sharp current coming through the lock across my fingers as they grasped the fastening. It continued for a few seconds, and then I seemed to hear a heavy body being laid down within. A moment afterwards, the door yielded suddenly to my hand, and I nearly fell into the room. The chamber appeared just as the night before. Poor Geordie was on the bed, and Dasi was standing beside him, and she alone drew my attention. She was panting, and her hair was disheveled, while the silk wraps she wore were damp and clung to her figure, and she looked as if she had just finished some violent exertion. I was surprised, but too concerned with what she might do next to say anything to her about it. "Now, Dasi, we must take him away," I said quietly, and to my intense relief, she only began to cry softly to herself. As I turned to call the men in, something else caught my eyes, and that was a heap of rupees, notes, and slips of paper on the little table by the bed, and a few were scattered on the floor. I stopped and told her to gather these up and put the money away before the men came in, and she did so. Then, with the help of those with me, I did what remained to be done, and soon afterwards left the bungalow. As we were going out, Dasi came to my side and put a packet of papers into my hand. "Those are for his debts," she said. "Remember, he owes no man a pice. Remember that." I thought it as well to take them for safety, wondering at her motive in giving me them just then, and I told her to go over to my bungalow and stay there while I was away with her valuables, but before I finished speaking, she ran back into the room from which we had just taken the body. It was a weary march, but I found the relays where I expected them, and we got into the station late in the afternoon. I had sent a note on ahead to the padre, and he was waiting for us at the little church. 3 or 4 other fellows who knew Geordie were there too, and stood round his grave. When it was all over, we left the spot together. As we were coming out of the gate, one man said, "Who's that crying?" And we stopped to listen. Sure enough, it seemed just as if a woman was sobbing somewhere close by, but it ceased, and I didn't try to think of what it was. We went straight to the station club, and found a lot of chaps there who were all sorry to hear about Geordie, and stood round talking of him. I was done up completely, and lay down in the cool, with a peg, and looked out over the river. After a bit I saw the mail boat coming up, and watched her fasten up to the bank. When she was moored, I noticed 2 English passengers from her coming towards us, and when they were closer, I recognized 2 of the Rangapor men, who had evidently run up from their district for a visit to ours. We all got up to welcome them, and see that they were refreshed, and it was just on the lips of everyone to tell about our sad affair, when one of them began to talk in a half-chaffing sort of way. "I say, by Jove," he said, "we're glad enough to see you fellows down our way, as a rule, but come one at a time, if you're all like the sample we've just struck of you. Great Buddha's tooth! He's ruined the district. We're all stony broke." "How's that, then?" said the boys, puzzled and interested. "Why, last night the beggar knocked about 6,000 rupees out of us at poker. He never lost, and played till daybreak. I never saw the like, nor want to." Who? Was the eager inquiry. "Who? Why, your precious Geordie Blair. Good God, what's up?" He might well ask. I sprang up, sending bottles and glasses flying. The other men sprang back as if he'd shot at them, and we all looked into each other's whitening faces. Then one of us, the doctor I think it was, went up to the newcomer. "Look here, are you in earnest, man? This is serious." "Before heaven, it is as I say. Why do you doubt me?" "Because he died yesterday," I said in a voice that sounded like another's, "and we've just buried him." The end.